Well, welcome everybody. I'm about to introduce you to a lady who had a visionary idea to see if there is a connection between bad eyes and great art. Here she is, Karen Denton. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you so much, and what a lovely introduction. As Claudette has mentioned, and as you can see behind me, we are both from Retina, South Africa. We're a very small but very effective organization. We do a huge amount between just a handful of people. There you can see Claudette and myself. And I'm also affiliated to the Low Vision Center of Learning in Retina. We work together. I do have a disclaimer. Our educational activities are supported by an unconditional educational grant from Bayer, South Africa. So now, today, we're going to talk about art and vision. And whenever I start this, I remember somebody saying to me one day, I've lost my sight, but I have not lost my vision. And I think that's a very important message for all of us. In this talk, we're going to look at the different visual defects that artists had and the effect that that had on their work through their lives. We know that many famous artists presented with a variety of visual problems. So I've just chosen a few here. So if you happen to have a favorite that I've left out, I apologize. There isn't time to cover all of them. But I've tried to represent a wide variety of problems. You will also see that some of these artists had more than one pathology, and some, in fact, were labeled as visually impaired if we looked at their art, but were they? Many showed deteriorating vision as they grew older and older. And as we look at these, as we go through this, I'd like you to ask yourself a question all the way through. What effect did their vision have on each one's artistic approach versus their own choices? Or was it a combination of the two? So we're going to start with a very interesting artist, and there are two of these who are completely blind. Now, Esraf Armagan is still alive. He lives in Turkey, and he was born blind. But at a very young age, he actually taught himself to paint. And there have been books and studies on him throughout the ages, the blind artist. And he paints totally according to touch and feel. So he will feel a model or a little toy of a fish and then be able to reproduce it. And if we look at his artwork through the ages, you'll see that it is astonishing how this man, who has never in his life been able to see, is able to produce in his work the most amazing depth of field. You can see what is close and what disappears into the distance. He has an incredible appreciation of the world around him, even though he cannot see it. The interesting thing is that he has been studied at Harvard University, where they did brain scans, and they found that when he is painting, the exact same areas, different areas in his brain light up that would light up if he were a fully sighted person. So that is interesting, and that is ongoing research as we talk now. In 2021, they're intensifying this to see what it is that makes this visual process come alive in the brain. And it obviously is not only the ability to see. And if we look at all of his art, he has that depth of field, he has an imagination, he has an appreciation of the world around him. The second painter that we're going to look at is John Bramblett, who now lives in El Paso, Texas. He is much younger, and he lost his eyesight when he was almost 20 overnight. So he also is completely blind. But if you look at the art that he produces, once again, the detail and the colors, everything is quite staggering. Now, I read recently that he says that he, by touching the paint that he uses, can feel if it is red, blue, green, or whatever the color is. And he's able to mix it and feel the texture that tells him what color he has and is able to paint with. And what he does is he draws the outline, like almost by a paint by numbers thing. He draws a little raised outline and then fills it in as he goes. He does very detailed stuff. He loves drawing nature. And there you can see him feeling his way as he draws a mural. And he is famous for the beautiful, amazing, highly detailed murals that he produces. And if you look at this one, what we can see, you can see that once again, the detail, the people, the trees, everything is absolutely amazing. And stress once again, he has no visual ability whatsoever. And when they've looked at him also at Harvard, they do the brain scans there and brain mapping, they find that also exactly the same sites light up as if he were a fully sighted man. Now, we're going to go back a little bit in history to start with El Greco. El Greco was believed to have severe astigmatism. Now, what astigmatism does to a person is it causes deformation of the light, and you then get a unidirectional elongation of objects, either vertically or horizontally. And that is classical of astigmatism. They very seldom see things exactly as they are. And yes, we know that he frequently elongated figures in his paintings. And let's have a look at that a little bit more. Have a look at this. You can see the long beard, the long face. Everything is extremely long. But if we look even more closely, we find that he elongates his figures in all planes, not only vertically, but also appropriately horizontally. So if you look at this man's hands, you can see that they are also equally elongated. So he was misdiagnosed as having astigmatism by people who hadn't looked close enough for a very, very long time. And we now realize that he probably did not have this because he only ever elongated religious people within a painting. And if they were not religious people, they were not elongated. So we now know that his artworks were probably a deliberate style choice. But there are many others who may have been affected by astigmatism, and they're being looked at right now. Holbein, Botticelli, Titian, Modigliani, Sargent, among many others. And if we just look at one of, for example, Modigliani's paintings, or two of them here, you can see that they are elongated, but only in one plane, in the vertical plane. So we ask ourselves, is this the way he saw them? Most probably because it is a feature that occurs in every one of his paintings and only in the vertical plane, never horizontally. So you'll see that looking at her hands, the hand that is held down is elongated, but the horizontal hand is normally sized and shaped. One of our favorite artists worldwide has and always has been Claude Monet. And he developed cataracts early in the last century, around about 1905. But he was terrified of cataract surgery because his friend Mary Cassatt lost her sight after surgery. But now when we look at that, we wonder what the pathology was And if it wasn't most probably what happens to a lot of people when they have the cataract out, it's in the front part of the eye, and it unmasks then the damage that is occurring or has occurred in the back of the eye, the seeing part of the eye, the retina. We know, and we will look now, that there are huge differences in Monet's work throughout his life. Before cataracts developed, with cataracts, and then post-operatively. So we'll have a look at that. In fact, we will see just now, and I'll mention again, that he actually destroyed a lot of his artwork. If we look at one of his very early works, you can see the detail, the meticulous drawing, every person on the boat in the front, the boat on the left, the sails, the rigging, every single thing is depicted with clarity, with beauty, and it's almost as though you're in that scene, you can feel it. As time passed, we know that one of his favorite subjects to paint was the lily pond in his garden, and especially the little Japanese bridge over the lily pond. And the water lilies, we know, are a huge favorite of his, and he painted them throughout the years. But let's see what happens when he paints exactly the same scene a little bit later. Here is a little bit later, and you can see that the water lilies are beginning to lose quite a lot of their definition. At the same time, he said, "I don't see red or yellow anymore." This is a quote from him. And this bothers me terribly because I know there is red, yellow, and green and purple on my palette. He couldn't see it. And because he couldn't see it, he couldn't use it as effectively as he should have. I don't see them as I did in the past, but I do remember what it was like. Now here is the Japanese bridge over his water lily pond, painted when he had cataracts. And as you can see, you can hardly see the Japanese bridge. You have to really use your imagination to determine what that is. And in the next picture, which is even worse, you can barely even see if there is a bridge there or not. We know it's there because we've seen the earlier work. Monet finally decided to have an op. And sadly, as I mentioned, very few canvases survived this time. He destroyed them as soon as he regained a little bit of sight. And when he consented to have just one cataract removed, he never allowed the second one. He was too terrified. We see that even with one eye, a lot of the detail returned to his work again. And at least I'm wondering what it would have been like had he been brave enough to have both eyes done. Another very interesting person to follow throughout his lifetime is Edgar Degas. We know that Edgar Degas had progressive retinal disease. He had totally lost his central vision by the time he was 40. He was diagnosed for ages and ages and ages with age-related macular degeneration. However, we now suspect that this was Stargardt's because of the age of onset, because usually if it is under the age of 40 and he'd already lost his central vision by 40, it was most probably Stargardt's, which presents similarly. You can almost say it is macular degeneration of younger people. However, he complained regularly of his infirmity of sight. He avoided glare at all times and preferred to work indoors. And that's why you won't find a painting of his done outside. And if we follow his artwork, we see that his visual acuity deteriorated from 20/40 and in just 10 years to 20/200. So he was legally blind, and his right eye was permanently damaged in his mid-40s. And by 50, he could no longer read at all. So let's have a look at the artwork in his life. If we look at this very, very early painting that he did. Just look at those flowers, each and every distinct petal, her earrings, her eyes, her eyebrows, nose, every detail is absolutely meticulously presented. And the longer you look at this painting, the more stands out of the incredible nature of every single bit and every detail that he puts into that canvas. Wasn't long after, when his sight started to fail, that we find that there's less and less detail. Still very beautiful paintings, very, very, very lovely. But as time passes, they become more and more sketch-like, less and less detail, until eventually they are really just a rough outline of what he wanted to present. If we look at the same nude that he painted 20 years apart, we find that in 1886, we can see her hair, we can see quite a lot of detail, her backbone, and everything is quite clear. By 1900, that's just 4 years later, you can see the detail is beginning to escape him. And just 5 years after that, it is really becoming quite a bizarre painting. And if you look at her right arm, who knows where it comes from or where it's going. It's not really, I think, what he meant to produce, but it's there. He then, at that stage, turned around and said, now I have to learn the craft of a blind man. And he resented this, which, well, I suppose a little bit sad, but heartwarming for us, because he turned to sculpture and then produced these absolutely wonderful figurines and little statuettes. They are wonderful in their detail. And he was able to use touch to replace what he couldn't do visually. Quite magnificent. And if you ever get to visit one of the art galleries that displays his work, as you walk around the artwork, it is just mind-boggling. It just grips you, the ability that he had to translate this as he did. After he died, they found more than 150 little ballerina sculptures in his studio that he had thrown away because he felt they were just simply not good enough. So as time passed, he tried to change and adapt his artistic lifestyle to suit his failing eyes. And as you saw, he was able to do this really successfully. He left many of his works unfinished because he was totally dissatisfied with them. He thought they were rubbish, but they were absolutely beautiful. His cousin had a similar eye condition that left him, GOGH, terrified of blindness. He was so afraid. And it was ironic that he was completely blind for many, many years before he died. The treatment that was available then was nothing. Excuse me, there was no treatment. He tried many spectacles, some of them tinted. The doctor tried to give him brown, blue, yellow, green glasses. They tried to occlude his damaged right eye, but he continued to complain. He would not wear the glasses for work. He found that they distorted his vision even more, but he felt that they were very kind of infra-dig, and a classy person wouldn't really wear glasses in those days. So he then avoided glare and worked just indoors. Had he been alive today, we would have started him early with really good lifestyle choices to preserve the retina, because we know that our environment can destroy our retinas. What the retina needs desperately, and this is why we're picking up so many problems today and why we have an epidemic of retinal damage, is the rainbow diet is needed every single day of every person's life to protect the retinas. In other words, eating every color of the rainbow every single day, especially green leafy vegetables, things like kale, spinach. They really are wonderful at protecting the retina. Smoking has another direct destruction on the eye. We would have limited his alcohol intake. And as you know, in those days, they drank raw alcohol and plenty of it. And when he started having the major problems that he had, we would have been able to give him what we call anti-VEGF injections. And this is what we give when they start to develop little aberrant blood vessels in the retina that rupture, they leak. You then get a bleed into the eye, and that you'll be blind within moments if that happens. So the anti-VEGF injections can protect from that. And so the diet would be very important for him. And we would also, in the early days, have started him on one of the supplements that we believe in for people with a retinal problem, an early retinal problem. And we know that there are all kinds of wonderful things happening today to support people, and a lot of research. And to remind people that research in South Africa with eye research is monitored by Retina South Africa, by us. The Maya machine is not available in South Africa. It's just too expensive, but it is available in Europe and the States, where people can retrain the seeing part of the eye, be able to see better again. Let's put it that way. Rembrandt van Rijn, very, very, very fabulous artist. His earlier works show a mastery of detail, light sensitivity, wonderful acuity and contrast sensitivity, incredible works, and we're going to look at some of them. But as time passes, we find that his detail gets less and less. There's less clarity, less light sensitivity, and the fine, fine brush strokes and careful precision that so typify his early works give way to loose, heavy, less defined work. And that makes us realize that it's almost certain that he had age-related macular degeneration. We also know that he had 2D vision. In other words, he had stereo blindness. Because if you look at all of his self-portraits, all of them, it shows that he had a divergent squint. His eyes look in different directions. So that means he couldn't see 3D. Now, for an artist, this is a huge benefit, because instead of looking at a picture and then reproducing it as you've interpreted it into a 2D, so that you can put it on canvas, he sees it in 2D already and can produce it exactly like that. So people with 3D vision have to reinterpret that scene to be able to produce it fairly accurately. So here's a very, very early work. And here you can see that Baal, the angel, the donkey, all of it in, as we've said just now, the most incredible detail, the finest brush strokes. It is quite magnificent, and what a beautiful painting. Once again, it's one that you can lose yourself in. The detail, the little leaves in the front, his hands, the beard, everything. Absolutely lovely. And look at those angel wings. Every time I look at this painting, I see something exciting and new that just grips me. Quite magnificent. What an artist. But we find that just a few years later, the paintings are looking a lot softer. Look at the rough. It's not quite as finely detailed as the previous painting. And as time passes, years later, we lose more and more and more detail. It becomes a little bit more sketch-like as time passes. And eventually, in one of his very late works, you can see that once again, very beautiful. He never loses this wonderful artistic approach, his appreciation of what is going on. But The fine detail is gone. Can you imagine what this painting would have looked like if he had drawn it the way he had Balaam his donkey, his ass? But the what a lovely painting. You can just lose yourself in it once again. That takes us now to Auguste Renoir. Very, very, very interesting story here, because he had myopia. In other words, he had difficulty seeing anything far away. He was short-sighted, in other words. But he also was smart enough to use this hugely to his own advantage. And we find that his backgrounds are perfectly blurred, which is exactly the way that he saw it. When he looked out into the distance, he didn't see a tree, he just saw a blur. And that's how he painted it. And we'll have a look at some examples in a moment. However, that contrasted with the foreground and anything close up in his painting. So the further you move away from where he sat to do the painting, the less detail there is. Now, this didn't change much through the years, but it's just interesting to see how he used his sight defect to produce really wonderful art. And here, if we have a look in the foreground, you can see the boat, you can see the people on the island, you can see the leaves on the tree in the foreground, but look at the leaves on the trees in the background. They're just a wonderful, beautiful blur of different colors of green, exactly the way he saw it. And if we look at this one, once again, the closer the person is to his perspective, the more detail there is. But as they begin to move further and further away, we lose more and more detail until in the background, once again, we have that perfect blurring of exactly what he saw. Quite wonderful. And even this young lady seated in the grass, you'll see that her parasol, her little flowers, much more detail than the two ladies on the bank. And on the far side of the lake, you can hardly make out what's there. Is it trees or is it, could be anything. So he used his ability to only see things close by to depict them exactly as he saw them. Paul Cézanne, another huge favorite. Now, Paul Cézanne, very interesting, he had diabetes, and this was triggered by poisoning because he used his fingers to paint with oils and then invariably licked and used his fingers to paint. And in those days, oil paints all contained lead. So he got lead poisoning that led to his diabetes. And the diabetes caused a severe retinopathy, and retinopathy also has a very dramatic effect on the vision. It started with a blue-green color blindness, and we'll see just now how that affected his work. He also had a bit of myopia, but he refused to wear glasses. He came from a very wealthy family, and once again, it was considered so infra-dig and not quite you to wear those vulgar things on your face. So he wouldn't wear them. And his paintings then became increasingly abstract because there was very little that they could do for him. And he, in fact, is thought of as the start of the post-impressionists. And very interesting. So here's an early painting. Once again, early painting means a lot of detail, fine brush strokes. You can see very, very clearly what he's depicting here. And as time passes, becomes a little less clear, a little bit of softness creeps into the painting. Still very lovely, as we've said before. And as time passes, the paintings become less and less accurate or precise. They become really quite abstract. Here are some nudes bathing, and you can see that the trees are beginning to just be shapes that are filled in here and there. And even more years later, you can hardly sometimes even work out what is what. You can work out the mountain for sure, and that this is a rural scene, but that is about all. And in this picture with the road going somewhere, you can hardly see what is what. Is that a cloud on the right, or is it part of a tree? In other words, his vision, as it deteriorated, showed in his artwork. It just became less and less and less precise, but once again, very pleasing to look at. Now, his treatment today would have been wonderful. We would have diagnosed both his diabetes and myopia, and these days, thank goodness, glasses are okay to be worn. And we would have also immediately stepped in with controlling his diabetes. We would get given him the same multicolored diet with lots of green vegetables and things. And we would have controlled his carbohydrate intake, especially starches and sugars, and also nasty fats, because there are different types of fats. And we would have made sure that he exercised properly. And we'll see just now that exercise wasn't really one of his problems, but we would have encouraged him to cease smoking and once again limit alcohol intake, which were both very popular in those days. People hadn't realized how damaging smoking can be, especially to the retina. And we would have obviously given him insulin and medications as needed. And not only that, having diagnosed him, if he then did develop the little, what we call these little blood vessels in the eye that do so much damage, and I'll digress here just to explain that a little bit more. In any part of the body, if you have damage to tissue, the body tries to compensate by growing extra little blood vessels to take sufficient oxygen, nutrients, etc., to the area and to pick up all the waste products. Now, unfortunately, those little blood vessels are very fragile. They are weak. They are not at all good. It's a bit like driving down one of our roads. It's full of potholes and they rupture very easily. And as I said, if you have a leaking vessel, or if you have a ruptured vessel, you're going to get an accumulation of gunk and blood in the eye. You can't see through that. So it's a major problem. So these days, we would have given him it's a tiny injection into the eye. And we would also have made sure that because there are different ones on the market, if somebody doesn't respond to one of them, because we know we all respond differently to different things. Some people respond to paracetamol, others to an aspirin compound. People are just different. We all respond differently to different things. So same with these. If they don't respond to the one, there are others that are available for them. We used to do laser, but we don't really anymore because that's more damaging than any other treatment, and certainly more damaging than the anti-VEGF injections. We would have also given him steroids and, if necessary, referred him for treatment on this magic machine, especially as he lived in Europe and would be able to retrain a seeing part of the eye to take over. And that brings us to yet another fascinating artist, and that is Mary Cassatt. Now, Mary Cassatt was a close friend of Degas and also knew Monet quite well. Now, remember we mentioned that Monet did not want to have his cataracts done after he saw what happened to Mary Cassatt. She developed cataracts and her vision deteriorated after cataract surgery. It was first thought that maybe there was an opacity of the posterior lens capsule, but she was then found to have diabetic retinopathy because she also had diabetes. And this affected her red, green, and blue, yellow perception, as we'll see in some of her artwork. Now, if you look at the date that this happened, 1912, and the years after that, was the First World War was just developing. So the war and the lack of doctors meant that she didn't really have access to good treatment that could have assisted her with her diabetes and or with her eye problems. And she had a second cataract operation just shortly after the war, and she was actually left with very, very limited vision. We know that with diabetic retinopathy, people are often asymptomatic for many, many years. And the only person who would know that something was going wrong is an ophthalmologist who looks into the eye. And this is why we always recommend that people visit an ophthalmologist once a year for an eye checkup, just the way you have your teeth checked or your medical checkup and all the others. The eyes are important too. We know, however, that she probably started with a bit of blurred vision because we can see it in her work. The diabetic cataracts then developed, and then the neovascularization, the damage in the retina. And this all interfered very much with her vision, and she started to see blurry patches, as you can see in the little picture on the right at the bottom. It's almost like having a spattered windscreen that you can't see through all that well. And this persists, and if it's not treated adequately and quickly, you can have a retinal detachment, and then your vision sadly is gone. But we do find that if we operate soon after cataract surgery, that all the visual centers in the brain that are important for visualization, artwork, etc., spring back into life, even if they have been dormant for a while. So we know that even today, a lot of patients phone us at Retina South Africa and they say that I had cataract surgery and now I can't see, because the cataract surgery caused me to have macular degeneration. No, that's like saying you had a sore knee and that caused you to have earache. It's a different part of the eye. It's unrelated. It can't happen. But sometimes the cataract surgery unmasks what is going on in the retinal area, and we then see that. So let's have a look at some of her works. Once again, oh, what beautiful, beautiful work. These young ladies looking out at the carnival below and ready to show flowers. The detail, the fine brush strokes, you can see almost each individual hair in each of these young ladies. Look at the necklace, look at all the detail is beautiful. The eyes, nose, mouth. And this is an early work that she was able to produce in the days that she still had very good vision, clearly. And years later, we find that not only is her color vision disturbed, but once again, you get the sketch-like quality where she's still very able to produce something beautiful, but there is no detail. You can't really see the detail in the eyes, the mouth, the nose, certainly to the extent that you could in the painting that we showed that was done 30 or so years earlier. So her treatment today, once again, with her diabetes, we would have diagnosed her, treated her, all the colors of the rainbow, we would have done all the important things, as we mentioned earlier, and her medication would have been monitored really, really carefully. And luckily, it's not a post-war area, and we've got wonderful doctors who are able to do that. But the moment she started to get any complications with an annual checkup, we'd have been able to pick that up and address it almost immediately. So once again, laser steroids and the Maya machine that we mentioned before. Excuse me while I have a sip of water. The next artist I'm talking about for a completely different reason, and this is Georgia O'Keeffe, because it is not always possible to presume that a painting or a series of painting in linear time show deteriorating vision. Because with Georgia O'Keeffe, have a look what happens. Her symptoms start in the late 70s, and she described her macular degeneration as a cloud entering her eyeballs, and she was eventually diagnosed with macular degeneration, but she then got assistance to come and help her to paint what she could still visualize in her mind. So her assistants came along to produce her later artworks. She stated, "I can see what I want to paint, even when unable to do so." But she was very able to tell her assistants what to do. So here we have a painting done in 1932, and just look at the detail. You can see the petal, you can see every tiny little bit, very fine brush strokes. If we go back in time, just 10 years earlier, we find that it's a lot softer, a lot more blurred. And if we look at one of her earliest ever paintings, we can see that there's very little detail. The blossoms are beautifully done, but you certainly can't call it fine brushwork as we see in her later pictures. So looking at her pictures, one would assume that they've gone in reverse order, but no. In this case, we see poor vision, and then when she started to use assistance, very, very sharp, clearly defined artworks. Now, Edvard Munch, very, very, very interesting story here, because he damaged his left eye in a fight in 1904 that led to a vitreous hemorrhage in that eye. But then he suddenly, a couple of years later, got a vitreous hemorrhage in the other eye. So we realized that he had a condition known as central retinal vein occlusion. So eventually, both of his eyes were damaged, both showed cloudy vision, and he described a black bird's head in his right eye. And this black bird absolutely obsessed him. In fact, he was very obsessed with these eyes, and you'll have a look at in a moment at that. As I said, he was obsessed, and he annotated his progress virtually day by day. He wanted to see exactly what was happening in his eyes all the time. So what he would do is he would draw a grid over his artwork to document any changes. So if he saw the bird had developed a little bit of extra bit here or a bit less there, or anything changed, he was able to see it in the grid because he examined each bit of every grid every day. So we now know that that was probably the forerunner of the Amsler grid that we still use today, because an ophthalmologist called Mark Amsler found that, he was Swiss, he found that Edvard Munch was doing this, and he thought, brilliant idea. And he devised the grid that to this day we use. So here is one of Edvard Munch's paintings, and you'll see that many of them show depicted eyes and often had a very dark theme. And you can see that with the black blotches around and the red, and it's not a happy painting. And he very often painted the black bird that he could see, and there you can see him closing one eye and looking at the black bird with his right eye. And then he would put this grid over it to see if the beak had elongated, if a feather had moved, if anything changed whatsoever on a day-to-day basis. And that is exactly how the Amsler grid works. We give people an Amsler grid, close one eye, look at the grid, and if the lines are all equal and not wavy or not missing, we know that that eye is untouched. And then we do the same with the other eye. We also use it to monitor people with retinal problems. So they close one eye, the other one about once or twice a week, just to see if there are any changes. It's actually a very easy, inexpensive, and wonderful way to monitor progress. And there you can see somebody looking at an Amsler grid. And as I said, close one eye, look at the middle, and if there are any spaces, wavy lines, missing lines, missing areas, dark areas, then we know that there's a problem with that eye. Edvard Munch painted the screen, as you all know, and he's probably more famous for that than anything else. But once again, look at the emphasis on the eyes. He's holding his ears, but look at the eyes. They are enormous and staring. This brings us to the final artist that we're going to look at today, Vincent van Gogh. And I've left him to last because there was just so much wrong with this poor guy. He had multiple eye problems, and we're just going to highlight 3 of the most important today. A lot of his eye problems were probably iatrogenic, which means caused by the medical profession, caused by his doctor. Because the maladies that he received treatment for included, now listen to this, epilepsy, persistent headaches, mental illness, nausea, melancholy, eye inflammation, and early cataracts. The problem is if you have digitalis, and if you have a little bit too much digitalis, the side effects are epilepsy, persistent headaches, mental illness, nausea, melancholy, eye inflammation, and cataracts. So the excess doses of digitalis that he received to control the pathologies were actually causing the pathologies and making them 10 times worse. So we had this vicious cycle of the more digitalis he took, the worse his condition became. The worse his condition became, the more Dr. GOGH gave him more and more medication. And here we can see a very gloomy looking Dr. GOGH holding a sprig of digitalis, or foxglove, and realizing at this stage that things were not going according to plan, and what could he do next? We also know that digitalis also caused not only blurred vision, but it causes yellow vision. It causes xanthopsia, everything in life. The yellow stands out. And they often see yellow and green halos around objects. So think about that. And if we look at many of his paintings, they are so yellow, you can't miss it. His famous sunflowers, his people, his fields, everything is just yellow from digitalis. But not only the digitalis, he also almost certainly had lead poisoning from, once again, the lead-based paints. And he used to lick his brush to get a very fine stroke when he wanted to. So he obviously licked a lot of the lead as well as being able to touch it. And lead causes swelling of the retina and the cornea, and that in itself causes circles and swirls all over the place. We also know that lead is neurotoxic, and it causes nerve and brain damage. It causes eye irritation, and he complained forever about eye irritation, and it causes cataracts. So poor Vincent not only had lead poisoning and digitalis poisoning that led to, as you can see, a lot of wavy appearances in his scenes, a lot of green and all that. But he also drank huge amounts of absinthe. Absinthe is wormwood, and it is a poison and is banned in most countries. In fact, the original absinthe you can't get at all. What they sell today is not the same thing. And absinthe causes hallucinations. It causes yellow vision, xanthopsia, once again. It causes seizures, erratic behavior, mental deterioration. Therefore, poor Van Gogh, he not only had the digitalis poisoning, he had lead poisoning, he had absinthe poisoning. It's no wonder the poor guy had such major visual problems. And it is no wonder that he ended up painting Starry Night. As we end here, I'd like you to ask yourself, would early diagnosis and appropriate treatment have changed, enhanced, and improved the artistic ability of the artists that we've looked at now? Or would it have allowed these artists to be more productive? How much of their work is caused by visual defects, and how much was their own choice and artistic license? Would their art have been helped? Would it have been hindered if they'd been born today, diagnosed and treated today? In other words, would we have had our beloved Starry Night? Thank you.
Karen, as always, we're always astounded by your depth of knowledge, and I'd like to open now and invite Sue to say a few words.
Well, talking about Starry Night, we've just had a star of a lecturer. Really, that was wonderful. In fact, that was something. In 1 short hour, you've made quite sure that we will never, ever look at paintings the same way again. And if you've got any more such wonderful talks, please, we actually want to see you again on DOTS. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sue. So now we are open to some questions. Remember, at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A and a chat button. So if you'd like to say anything, or if you would like to raise your hand, there's no one on Q&A or on chat at the moment. So let's see who we've got. Yeah, we have got someone on chat. Let's see now who we have. Let me just, thanks to DOTS for finding this wonderful lecture and so educational. Thank you so much for that, Landy. We hope you enjoyed it. That's great. Thank you. If there's any other questions, I just would like to add, for those, if you're traveling to Paris, please take a side trip to go to see Monet's house. The bridge is still there. It's the most wonderful day outing to get out of the traffic of Paris, to actually go and see his fantastic garden. And it's just as beautiful today as it was all those years ago. Let's see who else we've got. Have we got any other Q&A? We don't have, I don't see anybody with a hand up. Thank you, says Peter, for a wonderful talk. And Hazel says, a fabulous lecture. Thank you so much. Well, thank you for those kind words. And remember, if anybody is not sure about if they perhaps having any of these visual problems, we do, as Karen said, please go and see your ophthalmologist. And at our age, that's over the age of 40, you should be seeing your ophthalmologist annually to make sure that you don't have any underlying visual problems, because by the time you notice them in your vision, it's sometimes too late to treat. So let's see if we've got anything else here. On Q&A, I don't think there's anything. And on chats, I think we've handled all the chats. So I think with that, we can, it's almost past. If anybody has any questions for us that you feel a bit shy to ask, please go to our website, which is www.retinasa.org.za, and those questions will come through to Karen. So we would really like to thank you all for inviting us to come and share our message about retina and the effects it has not only on the artists, but on everybody's lives. So thank you for that, Dots, and we will end the webinar. Thank you, and bye till next time.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody, and thank you for being there.